Good morning. Good morning and welcome. I'm so happy to see folks here on a Saturday morning. It's not often that we are excitedly getting out of bed on a day off, but I think this is one of those occasions where it's exciting. I want to welcome you to the 2023 Dyslexia Symposium funded by the Ruth Harris Professorship. Dr. Lou and Ruth Harris were committed to supporting the needs of children with dyslexia and the professionals who support them. I'm so proud of our Ruth Harris scholars and the program team and excited about the agenda they've put together for you for today. Although the symposium is only once a year, we want to encourage you to take advantage of the other opportunities that we offer throughout the year. We would like to be a resource for you. So thank you so much for taking time to be here with us today. I met Chuck Harris, who now facilitates the Ruth Harris Endowment, and he met with Lisa Cipoletti and her Ruth Harris scholars and was really impressed with all of the things that are being offered. And one of the questions that he had was, or not he, but folks had was, why aren't more people participating in the events? They're so cool. So what we would just encourage you to do is, we think it's just lack of awareness. So we're just trying to get out on your radar about those events. And if you want any information about them, talk to Lisa or one of the Ruth Harris scholars. So I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Resha Conroy. Resha is the founder and executive director of the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children, a nonprofit organization working to eliminate the amplified inequities for Black children experiencing unaddressed dyslexia and related learning disabilities. She's a mother of 2 children with learning disabilities, 11 and 14 years old, and including a son who has dyslexia. Ms. Conroy is motivated by her family's journey to pursue her lifelong passion for educational equity. Ms. Conroy is a speech-language pathologist with a strong interest in language literacy and culture. She also has over a decade of experience in education and nonprofit management, serving on local school leadership teams. I'm sorry, not local, just school leadership teams. They're probably all over the country. And as a consultant for charter schools in Washington, D.C. and New York City. Ms. Conroy serves on the National Center on Improving Literacy Family Engagement Advisory Board, the New York City Department of Education Literacy Advisory Council, and Learning Ally National Advisory Board. So please join me in welcoming Resha Conroy.
Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. So I know some of you were probably up late. How many people saw The Right to Read yesterday? Yeah, it was an awesome, wonderful movie, really relevant. And I know Kareem Weaver has been a keynote speaker here in the past, so really fortunate to have had him here. And I feel really fortunate to follow in his footsteps today as your keynote at the 3rd Dyslexia Symposium. So thank you for having me. I also want to thank the conference team, so Lisa Cipoletti, Sabrina Wright, who've been working with me to make this a very seamless process. So I'm visiting here from New Rochelle, which is right outside of New York City. And it's my first time in Richmond, so a lot of firsts for me as well. I was speaking with the dean before I started, and we were talking about being a speaker, and I said, well, actually, I don't have speaker on my LinkedIn profile. So I have founder, I have executive director, I have speech language pathologist, I have consultant, but a few years ago, I never would have imagined that I would be delivering keynotes. I end up in this position because of the work that I do and because of the message that must be shared. So I'll take a breath and try not to faint, but work with me this morning, we'll get through it. And I have my note cards, so this is what I rely on to make sure that I stay on track, because there's so much to say and so much to share. So thank you, all of you, for being here. So I'm honored to have this opportunity, like I said, to share my story and to share my why. And my why is a collective why. It's not just my why, it's the why of my community. And to share it with change makers. And I consider all of you to be change makers in this movement towards racial justice in the literacy space. So thank you for that. My name, again, is Resha Conroy. And my most important role is my role as a mother. So I have 2 wonderful, amazing children who support me and are super excited that I'm here. My daughter was rehearsing my speech and I'm like, stop it, I'm gonna hear your little voice in my head as I'm giving it. But yeah, they're both really wonderful and they're both neurodiverse, as am I. And that's something that I learned later in life as I was going through the journey with them. So it's been a journey. It's been a journey for me. It's been a journey for my family. And the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children was part of that journey. And it was founded in 2020. So we're a relatively young nonprofit. So we were founded right in the midst of the pandemic, right? So I live in New Rochelle. I'm gonna put my cards down for a second so I can tell you a little bit about this. So I don't know if you remember, during 2020, Governor Cuomo was giving his daily briefings and he declared the containment zone. Here's our containment zone. And I lived right here, right outside the containment zone. So COVID was very real for me, very real for my family. A lot of my family members are healthcare, are working healthcare, were in the hospitals, on the front lines, seeing the devastation. My dad was working at a nursing home at the time. The refrigerated trucks were outside his building. So it was very real. And of course, we were all shut down, right? So everything shut down. My son's school was one of the first schools that closed because that patient zero, and I put it in quotes because I don't actually think he was patient zero. A lot of his friends, the friends at his school had been in an event with patient zero. So his school shut down almost immediately. But it was also right after the murder of George Floyd, right? So I never watched the video. I didn't need to watch the video to understand that his humanity had been robbed. I also didn't want to traumatize myself because my son, who's now 14, is this tall, and he loves to wear hoodies. And I have to tell you that I always sort of cringe inside when I see him with the hoodie because Trayvon Martin's image comes to mind. And so I'm like, take the hoodie off. And I know I'm robbing him of something that he enjoys, but as a mom with a son who's this tall, who's Black, who's walking down the street, I have fear. So that was that summer. And for me, it was a time to act because in my lifetime, there really had not been another moment like that. There had not been another moment where the veil of inequities had been pulled back. So we saw the inequities in access. We saw the inequities in healthcare, the inequities in education. And quite honestly, whether you lived or died depended on the zip code that you lived in, what hospital you walked into. I saw that. Whether or not you had access to virtual learning depended on your zip code. So did you have a device? Did you have access to the internet? We saw all of these disparities that were so often invisible, very visible. And of course, they were always very visible to the people who were experiencing firsthand. So it became a time to act. And I don't think that prior to 2020, there would have been a space for an organization called the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children, right? Even after 2020, I have people who approach me, and many of them are well-meaning, and they ask me, well, why for Black children? Why not all children? Why not all children of color? And what I say to them is, first of all, this is a complex problem, right? So no simple solutions. And I use the lens of intersectionality and social identity in understanding complex problems. And so focusing on Black children doesn't erase the need in any other community. And in fact, I do think we need parallel organizations in other communities that have been historically underserved. But this organization was founded based on my lived experiences, right? So what I've seen, what I've experienced firsthand. And I also strongly believe that solutions should come from communities. They should be community driven, right? So that's part of it. And then of course there's the data, right? And we'll see some of the data in a few slides, but there's the data that shows us the inequities when it comes to literacy, when it comes to dyslexia diagnosis. Now, the other part of that was when I heard it, and like I said, I think most people were well-intentioned, but it kind of also made me pause and wonder why I needed to connect or justify equity for Black children, and why it felt like I needed to attach it to someone else's humanity in order for it to matter. So that's where we are. Let me move the slide ahead. So DABC was founded, and our mission is to eliminate those amplified inequities for Black children experiencing dyslexia and certainly other learning disabilities. Now, as I said, my background is in education reform. I'm a speech language pathologist. I've worked in charter schools. But what brings me to this space was my experience with my son. So my son has dyslexia, as I mentioned, and I faced a lot of the barriers that a lot of families face. So I had difficulty getting him a diagnosis. I had difficulty getting a comprehensive evaluation, so an evaluation that actually told me what was going on with him, and an affordable evaluation, right? Because depending on where you are in the country, maybe $3,000, but in New York City, it can be as high as $10,000 to do a comprehensive evaluation. You can still bring it to the school and they'll tell you no, right? So you're also making an investment and not really knowing what the outcome is going to be. For my son, none of these things existed in his local public school. And he, at the time, was in a high-performing school district, but I couldn't get any of those things there for him. What I also heard, and it wasn't surprising to me, but I heard the language of low expectations for him, right? So who's here is familiar with this idea of low expectations in the research that shows us that very often teachers have lower expectations for Black students, and absolutely lower expectations for Black boys. And it shows up in the data, shows up in the research. You can use Google Scholar or whatever you have access to go through a lot of the research around this. But the research isn't what told me that. That's not why I knew that. I knew that because of my experiences. So, I can recall being in 7th grade, and my teacher, who was a white woman, looked at the class, and a class full of mostly Black students, and told us, don't expect to grow up and be Bill Cosby or be like the Cosbys. So this was in the 80s, and yes, I'm dating myself. But Cosby was new to us, right? Like this watched it every, was it Thursday night, I think at 8 o'clock? But it told a story of Black achievement, right? And she told us, don't expect to grow up and be like him. Why not? Why shouldn't I expect to grow up and be a lawyer or be an attorney or live in a brownstone? She was smashing those dreams for us and giving us the language of low expectations. And that's what I heard from my son. So when his reading was on the low end of average, they told me that was fine. It was fine if his reading's on the low end of average. I shouldn't worry about it. And he did really well on a non-reading assessment, so scored like in the 99th percentile. He actually is really good with visual spatial things, which I understand a lot of people with dyslexia are. And I actually, when I'm putting something together from IKEA, I call him because I can't do it, but he can do it. Doesn't even have to look in the instructions, just like that. And so he scored really high on this. And the school psychologist turned to me and asked me, are you surprised he's so smart? And I said to myself, because I was still trying to partner with the school and play nice, right? I wasn't surprised because I have high expectations for him, but I understood that the school was surprised because they had low expectations for him. So they couldn't even, imagine him as a reader, let alone someone who had dyslexia. And what I realized was that they were setting the stage to make it acceptable for him not to read. And that is the same stage that's being set for many of our students. So when we look at the 2022 NAEP scores, and they don't change that much by year, so I could really pull up any year, we know that only 17% of Black or African American 4th graders, public school students, are reading at or above NAEP proficiency. But there's no national outcry, right? Where's our movement around this? Because the stage has been set to make that failure acceptable. But for me, for my son, every alarm went off, right? And for me, it was a matter of life or death. Because just like many of you know, literacy is essential. We need literacy to be able to be successful in society, to be able to interact, to be citizens. But I also knew that it was a very powerful protective factor. And so the absence of that for him as a Black boy who would be a Black man was absolutely unacceptable, and it was terrifying, very terrifying for me, because there are no soft landing spots in America for a Black man who cannot read. And that is the case for many of our students. It needs to be a matter of life and death. Now, my son was diagnosed very early, so I saw the signs in kindergarten, but go through the process. And he did have a speech and language delay, so I was also aware that this might show up when he got to kindergarten. And so people will look at me and say, well, you got him diagnosed really early. That's really great. How did you do that? What did you see? How did you know? And what I'll tell you is that I didn't know, right? So I had one semester completed in my speech language program, and I took a break because I had 2 small children, and anyone who's familiar with the program, very demanding. And so I took a break. So I had some knowledge of language development, but I really didn't know anything about dyslexia, right? So that's not what caused me to act early. I'll tell you what did. It was my experience as a Black girl in our traditional school settings, and knowing that they historically fail Black children. So when something felt wrong, I didn't wait. I didn't say, well, I'm going to trust the school. They have his best interests at heart. Nope, those alarms went off. And I acted quickly because of that. So DABC, like I said, was founded to address this issue, right? And to bring this awareness and this information to families so they could act on behalf of their children in the way, and even better, because I've learned so many things along the way. There's so many things looking back now that if I had known, I would have done differently. My son is now 14. He is getting ready to go to high school next year. And I'm thinking about what's that part of the journey going to look like for him, right? So our organization, about 20% of our work is with educators, with researchers, and we're bringing awareness to dyslexia, of course, but also to this intersection of dyslexia and race for Black children. And I think of it really as racism and ableism, and that intersection that we don't speak enough about. And then the other 80% of our work is with families, right? So I believe that if we support families and we inform families, they can be transformative in the educational experience of their students, right? So the information, but also the support, because it's a lonely journey and it can be very isolating, and you need people around you who can affirm your experience, but also let you know, yep, you know what you're seeing, that happened to me too, and this is how I navigated. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can learn from the experiences of others. So you know a little bit about me, you know a little bit about my organization, and now for the topic, right? So the keynote, the intersection of literacy, race, and dyslexia, racial justice in the literacy movement. So we're going to go through this journey, and we're going to talk about literacy. So why even bother to include literacy in this conversation? We're also going to use a historical lens to see how we got here, right? Because it didn't begin today. There's history behind this. And if we don't understand the history, we won't understand or even be able to formulate the right solutions, because we won't know what the root cause is. What's the root cause of the issues that we see here? And like I said, I use this lens of intersectionality, so social identities, and I'll talk about what that means when we get to that slide and dive into it a little bit more. And then there'll be lots of questions, right? The truth is, there are examples of success, but there's not a lot of research in this area. You can Google this, you're not going to find a lot. So we have to formulate the right questions, we have to do the right research, and that will move us towards solutions. So literacy. I'm going backwards. Right, it seems like one of the buttons is not working here. Let's see. Literacy for what? There we go. I'll keep it oriented this way so I don't mess it up again. So why literacy? Why are we here? How important is literacy in your life? Right? What does it give you access to? Could you imagine not being able to read and what you would not have access to? So imagine the cognitive load if you had to navigate even directions getting someplace. Of course, now we have a lot of what I call assistive technology devices that can help support us. But think about how you would feel sitting in a classroom every day, not being able to access the curriculum because you can't understand the written word, right? So here's Frederick Douglass, right? Everyone recognizes the picture probably, and most of you probably recognize the quote. So once you learn to read, you will be forever free, right? How many of you have seen this quote before? Right, it shows up a lot in our literacy spaces, and I use this quote in almost every presentation because it is so true. Now, the thing about a quote, and this is with any great speech, a Bible scripture, I always want to know what came before that quote, and I want to know what came after the quote, right? For Frederick Douglass, it's a lifetime. A lifetime before the quote, a lifetime after the quote. So most of you are also familiar with Frederick Douglass, I would imagine. He was enslaved. He fought for his freedom. He later became a great abolitionist, a great orator, a reader, a writer. And his narrative is a very, very powerful piece. And so I actually have it here with me today. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And so, yes, calling on the ancestors for inspiration as I speak today. But what I want to share with you is a little bit about this journey and this quote, right? So he learned to read. He was taught by the mistress of the house. So it was the white woman who was the head of the plantation. Her name was Miss Auld. And it opened his eyes, it opened his mind to the power of the written word, right? He enjoyed the stories that he was reading. He saw his experiences reflected in books that he read. And he talks about how powerful it was to have that experience with Mr. Auld. The other part of it is that Mr. Auld, who was the enslaver, discovered that he was being taught to read, right? And he put a stop to it immediately, right? And so what he said was that he forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me, further telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. Learning would spoil him, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, and that it would forever make him unfit to be a slave. He would become unmanageable and of no value to his master. Now, here's the quote. What Frederick Douglass tells us is that those two things motivated him. So Mrs. Auld, giving him access to the written word, and the words of Mr. Auld. Because in that, he says that he understood something that had perplexed him for so long, the white man's power to enslave the black man. And because Mr. Auld was fighting so hard to keep literacy from him, he was more focused and more determined to learn to read because he imagined that in literacy, there was freedom, transformation. Not an easy transformation, right? So not, I learned to read and everything is fine. It was painful because he talks about reading and understanding how cruel and inhumane American slavery was. And so he was tortured by that enlightenment as well. And he even at one point questioned whether or not he should have remained ignorant, right? So this transformation is painful. It's not just 1, 2, 3, and it's easy. But he had freed his mind. And later, he went on to free his body, right? So he was able to go to the North, lived in Massachusetts, and became a powerful abolitionist. So I share this because when we use this quote, and when we think about literacy as freedom, I want you to remember that this literacy advocate, right, was also an abolitionist. And he wasn't reading just to read. He was reading to transform his life. And what I want to tell you is that for your students who have been historically underserved, historically marginalized, who share the legacy of Frederick Douglass, we have to give them literacy in order to transform their lives. So there is no disconnecting literacy from racial justice. So when you quote them right, okay? All right, so literacy as transformational extends across the globe. And in fact, the United Nations defines it as transformative, as essential, right? And so we know obviously in many countries, access to education, access to literacy is not a human right, but it should be one. Yet, what do we have, right? So this number is familiar to everyone, right? So this is 2019, but like I said, the numbers don't change that much. This is the percentage of all fourth grade public school students who are reading at or above proficiency based on NAEP, only 34%. So if literacy is transformative, why do we continue to deny it to so many students? What's happening here? Now, I'm going to share more about this number. We're going to dive into it a little bit more. But before we go there, I want to pause and define something. I want to define educational equity. And some of you may be familiar with this. It comes from a book by Elena Aguilar, Coaching for Equity. And she defines educational equity as meaning there is no predictability of success or failure that correlates with any social or cultural factor. And she goes on to list a few, right? So race, ethnicity, linguistic background, any of those, right? So we have a problem. Guess what? Literacy is almost perfectly predictable by race and ethnicity and economic class. So we can go down the list, right? So we're dealing with educational inequities. And so let's take a look at what this looks like. So this is 2019, and I needed to update this so the x-axis is a little bit cut off. But we see the numbers here. So you see the 34%, right? That's all fourth graders. And then it goes up. It goes up to 55% for Asian or Pacific Islanders. It goes up a little bit, right? But that's still just over half. So we're still failing a lot of those students as well. And then it drops down to 44% for white fourth graders. And then it plummets, right? So if you're Hispanic or Latino, it drops down to 23%. Native Americans, 20%. African American fourth graders, 18%. So do we have educational equity? Nowhere close to it. What are we doing in classrooms? What's happening to these students? Again, where is the national outcry? So before I continue, I want to share a really short story. So in my work, sometimes I speak to legislators about universal screeners and evidence-based practices, bringing them into the classroom. And I was speaking with a state legislator, and I'm from New York State, and I'll tell you that it was not a New York State legislator. It was another major city in the country. And we were talking about the need for universal screeners. And he listened, and he turned to the group, it was about a group of 3 or 4, and he said, we don't need this, right? It's not important, it's not the most important thing. There's a bunch of other things that are more important. And then he said, well, somebody has to be poor, right? This is a legislator. And I bring this story up because as we think about solutions and we think about systems, I want you to also consider how much of this is purposeful, right? If we know what to do, then why aren't we doing it? And hearing that coming out of the mouth of a legislator indicates that a lot of this might be purposeful and that perhaps the system is not broken. Maybe the architecture is perfect, right? Because we can predict the outcome, so maybe it's working really efficiently. And if it is working really efficiently, what does that mean about our solutions? We're gonna have to really think outside the box to get this right. We may have to be like Frederick Douglass and be abolitionists in our work to get this correct. All right, so the other thing that often comes up, and I'm going through this because in this journey, I get pushback a lot, which is surprising. People will tell me, well, it's not about race. If we just gave everyone money, it would be fine. It's about socioeconomic status, right? And there was a study that was done in 2016. And so this is prior to the pandemic that asked this question, right? How much of these differences in test scores could be attributed to injustice or racial discrimination, racial injustice? And 44%, so just nearly half said none of it, right? So we're colorblind, none of it. Only 10% said a great deal. Now, this was prior to 2020, so maybe some of this has changed. I imagined it hasn't because the pendulum is swinging back. in the other direction, and we are feeling it, and we're having a lot of rhetoric that continues to try to erase what we know exists, but it's there. So what I've done for you is I've pulled up the numbers by race and socioeconomic status, right? Let's look at the data. Let's see if this does exist. So Black or African American fourth graders, and this is still 2019, for those who are eligible for free or reduced lunch, so I'm using that as the poverty line, only 13%, right? So that number dropped from our 18%. Only 13% were reading at or above NAEP proficiency levels. Now, if you were not eligible for free or reduced lunch, it goes up to 26%. So, yep, socioeconomic status matters. We all know that matters, right? And then when you look at white fourth graders, if you're eligible for free or reduced lunch, 29%. If you're not eligible, 54%. So does socioeconomic status matter? Absolutely, absolutely matters. Life is a lot easier when you have money, even on a bad day. But does it erase race? It doesn't. So if you are Black and you are not eligible for free or reduced lunch, doing about as good as the white fourth graders who are eligible for free or reduced lunch. That's telling you something. Something is happening here when we put race into it. So let's think about this as a human right, right? So I have here just a few of the efforts, the lawsuits around literacy and of course, education in general. We have Detroit, we have Baltimore, those are Black cities, right? In Detroit, there was a literacy lawsuit. And what was interesting about it is that as a result of the lawsuit, they still said there was no constitutional right to read, right? That's not actually a part of our Constitution, but they did settle, right? They did settle the lawsuit, but it set no legal precedence for that constitutional right to read. So we still have work to do there. In Baltimore, we have this longer story. So beginning in 1996 up to, and there may be some updates to this, but August 12th of 2022, right? They found that Baltimore City had so poorly funded their educational system. And what they said about their graduating 12th graders, when they looked at their skills, they said it was as if they had not been to school at all. You know, you're 17, you're 18, you're getting ready to enter the world, and you look at your skill set and you say it's as if you had not been to school at all. What's happening in the building? What I can tell you is that these students probably never felt like they belonged in school, right? Those low expectations, the behavioral expectations that were set. And then our neighbors to the north in Ontario, the Human Rights Commission did a study, and they also said that it was a human right. And that of course, literacy, low literacy was impacting students with reading disabilities in Ontario's public education system. So we have a lot of work to do in the United States, but certainly across the globe, because these systems do exist in any place on this globe that was touched by Western civilization, to be quite honest. So we know that it's a human right, not necessarily the great equalizer, but like I said, for my son, I knew that it could be a powerful protective factor. And so I imagine many of you know what a protective factor is, right? It's something a factor that you have that helps to reduce the likelihood of an adverse outcome. So we'll go back to wealth, right? Wealth is a protective factor, very powerful one. Having caring, loving adults in the household, in your life, is another protective factor. Your zip code is probably going to be a protective factor, right? So there are lots of protective factors. But how do we know that literacy is a protective factor? So again, many of you are probably familiar with this first data point. Children who reach fourth grade without being able to read proficiently are more likely to struggle and eventually drop out of school, right? So if you're not reading by fourth grade, we can almost predict that you're going to have difficulty, that you may not make it to 12th grade. I can tell you where a lot of those students go because we know a lot about the school to prison pipeline, unfortunately. And then there was a study done by Barwick and Siegel where he looked at the homeless youth population. And he found that 52% of homeless young people had a learning disability. And we know that dyslexia is the most common learning disability. And this is significantly higher than the general population. So when you don't have literacy as a protective factor, you're starting to see the increased likelihood of these adverse outcomes. And of course, we know about the Texas prison study that was replicated in some other states as well, but 80% of incarcerated adults are functionally illiterate, with about half of them having word attack skills that are consistent with the dyslexia diagnosis. Now, what's interesting about this is when you infuse the prison system with an educational program, including literacy, we see recidivism rates decrease, right? Now, my question is always, so I'll start off again. So if you go to prison, you're illiterate, right? You learn to read in prison. When you get out, the likelihood of you going back decreases. Do you understand how powerful that is? Why won't we do that in early elementary school? In fact, we don't even test in our juvenile delinquency centers. We don't test for dyslexia. The law doesn't allow us to introduce an IEP once they're in the system. They have to leave it and get back into the school system to get that. We refuse to do this on this side, but we'll do it on this side. Of course, there's also a lot of money in the prison system, but that's another story for another day. Another study that I really like is one that came out of the University of Minnesota. And so this is the last bullet. And this study, interestingly enough, was not about literacy. It was about resilience. So they were, and I was doing a workshop on trauma-informed practice. And so what they did was a longitudinal study, and they looked at families who were without homes, who were homeless, or who were highly mobile, right? So that, of course, is something that has a significant impact on a family. They also were living below the poverty level. And what they found was, as they followed these students, for those students who were reading by first grade, even with them being homeless, they still had better life outcomes. And they concluded that more needed to be done to look at literacy as a protective factor when we think about resiliency for children. So can we all agree that literacy is absolutely a protective factor? Yeah, right. I agree with that as well. Again, like I said, we don't have it. So now we're going to use the historical lens, right? So we know that this period of 1619 to 1865 was a period of enslavement of African Americans, and we had anti-literacy laws, right? So if you can read the screen or see it, you'll see an excerpt from a newspaper, and it tells us that if someone taught an enslaved person to read, or if an enslaved person was found reading, it was punishable. It could be punishable by a beating, but also punishable by death, right? Very, very extreme thing to go to, right? But we see this sort of in Frederick Douglass's story, right? So why? Because even at that time, there was this understanding that literacy was protective. Now, the interesting thing about this is that not all enslaved Africans were not allowed to read. Some were. They were allowed to memorize whole words. So if you needed to conduct the business of the plantation, you might be allowed to memorize the words for sale, right? Sale or whatever the transaction entailed. They were also allowed to memorize whole Bible passages, not the whole Bible, just very specific passages of the Bible. And we know that memorizing is not reading, right? Just memorizing whole words, not reading. And they knew that 400 years ago. But we still see that in schools, right? We still see that we're not teaching students the code of the language. And this is what was restricted all those years ago. So this power of literacy is not new. It's well known. And then we have the period of 1865 to 1954. So now we have Jim Crow and we have segregation. And the two pictures that I have here, it's not the Jim Crow South. That's the Jim Crow North, right? So the consistency of policies and practices. So the first picture is Boston. The second is Queens, New York. Jim Crow was essentially a system that made Black Americans second-class citizens, right? So where you could eat, where you could drink, where you could go to school, and certainly a lot of this was punishable by death because lynchings is an unfortunate but real part of our history as well. And then, of course, segregation. Segregation not just of bodies, but also of resources. Now, we, of course, had desegregation, and it's debatable how successful that was, right? So here on the screen, I have a book, The Lost Education of Horace Tate. And I think that sums it up very well. We didn't have desegregation. We had second-class integration, right? So we integrated Black students into classrooms, but continued to treat them as second-class citizens. So we robbed them of the values of their community, the strengths of their community representation, so seeing teachers who looked like them standing in front of the classroom. Because when we desegregated schools, we also removed Black educators, right? 32% reduction in Black teacher employment in Southern districts that went from fully segregated to fully integrated. And do we still see that today when we look at our teaching profession? Yep, we do. And it matters, right? There's studies about that as well. I won't go into them in the interest of time, but that absolutely matters. So we don't have anti-literacy laws anymore. You're not going to open the books and see something that says you cannot teach Black children to read. That's illegal, right? We've gotten that part right. We don't have that on the books anymore. And so the measure is no longer in the law. The measure is in the outcomes. And the measure is in the consistency of those outcomes. So here's the United States. And we see the percentage, again, of Black fourth graders who are reading at or above proficiency. And we can look at it across the country. So for those states that are reporting, they're in a shade of blue. It ranges anywhere from about 75 to 89% of Black students who are not reading at proficiency. So in Virginia, in 2019, 81%. My state of New York, 84%. The consistency of the inequities is our measure. Okay, let's skip over that. So what do we have? We have what I call racialized opportunities. And how did I get here? I certainly didn't coin this. This comes from the research. But we used to talk about achievement gaps, right? I never loved that word, achievement gap, measured by who? Then we talked about opportunity gaps, and that feels a lot more correct, right? There's certainly gaps in opportunities. But I'm going to push it further and tell you we don't just have opportunity gaps, we have racialized opportunities. So what you have access to or don't have access to might largely be dependent on your race. And we see this, right? We see this in the disparities by race in the numbers. We see this in the disparities by access. So access across many things, across education, but certainly across healthcare, across many of our institutions. So now let's talk about the intersection of racism and ableism. So now we're getting to it, right? What is this all about? Now, intersectionality is a bad word, right? This is 2023. If you say it, you can't say it in certain states, right? But what is it? So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, right? 1989. Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar, and her team coined this term, and they coined it to explain a case, right? So a Black woman brought a case against a corporation for employment discrimination. She said there were no Black women managers at her company. So the judge dismissed the case. And he dismissed it because he looked at the company, he looked at the managers, and he said, well, you have Black managers and you have women managers. So you have no case. What Kimberly Crenshaw did, she looked at it deeper. And she said, okay, yes, there are Black managers, but guess what? all of those Black managers are men. And there are women managers, but all of those women managers are white. But there were no Black women managers. And that's what social identity is. And that's what intersectionality is. The erasure of this woman because her multiple social identities were not considered. And I use this, so she coined the term, but she didn't create the situation, right? It's always been there. And I use this when we think about Black children with dyslexia who are essentially invisible in our literacy spaces, right? They're invisible in our classrooms, but if you go to a lot of the literacy or dyslexia conferences, you don't see a lot of Black families, see a sprinkle here and there. If you go to our specialized dyslexia schools, so now we're talking about truly places of privilege, you see one or two Black students, maybe, but not a lot. Black students with dyslexia are invisible, and so they're facing racism, so the language of low expectations, expectations around their behavior, more likely to be misdiagnosed. So you see the behavior first before you saw that there was a reading problem, and then they become penalized for it. And we have to be really careful in this literacy movement not to create a single axis. It cannot be just about literacy. It never was, right? Going back to Frederick Douglass, it was about racial justice. So moving beyond a single axis literacy movement, what do we do, right? What do we do with all of this information? It's a complex problem. There are no simple solutions to this. So I'm going to try to simplify it as much as I can. And I'm going to show you an intersection, right? A single axis literacy movement looks like this. So here are our numbers. Again, some of the same numbers that you saw before, but now they're broken out by race and socioeconomic status. And that red line is the proficiency level. And you can see, again, socioeconomic status matters, but race and ethnicity also matter. And even in those states where we have infused the science of reading, guess what? That gap is still there. So is the science of reading enough? Not according to the numbers. What is it that we're missing? So here's an intersection, right? We have all been in a car. Many of you are probably drivers. If you're not, you've been a pedestrian or you've been a passenger. We all know about those intersections that are a little bit crazy. Sometimes, typically called 4 corners, sometimes 5 corners. And if you're crossing and you're driving, you're just a little bit more careful because there's always an accident there, right? So when we have a real intersection where we know it's dangerous, typically you'll have some sort of traffic study done, right? So maybe your city or your town, you'll have some parents or some citizens who say something needs to be done here to make this intersection safer because it's dangerous. So on this road, we have dyslexia. Dyslexia, and I'm honing in on that because that certainly could be any disability, but that would be a much larger conversation, right? So specifically dyslexia on one axis and then racism on the other axis. So let's think about dyslexia and let's think about a road that needs to be safer. So what would you do, right? You were going to add something to that road for someone who needed to cross it. What's something that you could add? You got it and you jumped ahead. you're on it. No, that's good. Exactly. You took me there. All right. So yeah, so you add a speed bump, right? Evidence-based instruction in our general education classroom. So let's give every child access to what we know works, right? That's not so difficult. Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to get that legislation passed and to get people moved beyond those things that they hold so dearly that we know does not work. But you put a speed bump, right? So what else can you put there? How about a traffic light, right? And did I repeat this one? So evidence-based instruction, you can add a traffic light. So RTI maybe, you can add something else, right? You can say that's still not enough. How about a crossing guard? So have you ever had to cross the street, the crossing guard comes out, some of them are really enthusiastic about their jobs and they'll just stop all the traffic, shut you down. shut everything down. We're going to make it really safe for this child to cross. So we have evidence-based literacy instruction in the general education classroom. We have RTI, so we have universal screeners. We have progress monitoring. We have, well, actually, shouldn't just say RTI, a good system, right? Because a lot of them exist and they're not doing what they're supposed to do. Still not identifying students. We're still not giving them what they need at tier 2 and tier 3. But we can add these things. That's not so difficult, right? And I think Dr. Burke from out of Mississippi says that literacy is a solvable problem. I agree with that. We can solve literacy. Where does it get difficult? When we get to racism. So who can tell me, what are the solutions that we presented? So it was easy to kind of come up with something for literacy. What if we presented for race? That's my answer too. Absolutely nothing. Maybe in pockets of the country, you certainly do see some efforts and you see some research here, but we've really done nothing to address that other axis. It's time, because we will see that we'll infuse our schools with science of reading and we'll still have those racialized opportunity gaps. So, and let me look at the time. I am hopeful, if not optimistic. I believe, and I'm here and I do this work because I believe we can do it. So I want to share two quick stories. The first one is, and I'm still using historical perspective. When we look at the period of enslavement of Africans during that time, and there were some records that were kept, it was estimated that about 10% of enslaved Africans knew how to read. And then slavery was abolished and something happened. There was this focused, purposeful, driven action to make sure that every formerly enslaved African had access to literacy. And so in that period, and it's a very brief period right after the abolition of slavery, that number went from 10% to 70%. Can it be done? Absolutely. What undid it? Artificial barriers. That's what undid it. Jim Crow. That's what undid it. And we can go down the line with all of the policies and practices to present day that continue to undo what can be done, because all of it is artificial, created by structural racism. Now I want to tell another story, and this one is one of my favorites, is the Missouri floating schools. So Minister John Berry Meacham lived in Missouri, and Missouri was a state that had anti-literacy laws. So he wasn't allowed to teach enslaved Africans to read. So what he did was genius, as are so many of the things that have come out of our community in the face of systemic racism. He took a steamboat and he floated it out on the Mississippi River. He floated it just outside of the jurisdiction of the Missouri laws. And there he taught enslaved children and adults to read. This was in the mid-1800s. He did it on a steamboat. He didn't have the internet. He didn't have all the resources that we have today, yet he did it. He did it because he was courageous. He did it because he faced and acknowledged what existed, which was the systemic barriers to access. He did it because he was an abolitionist. And that is what we have to do today if we want to see real change. Now, the interesting thing about the floating schools is that I always say we should work for change in both places. We do need to change, perhaps abolish the public education system. But in the meantime, we have third graders and fourth graders and fifth graders who are sitting in classrooms who cannot read. So we need to construct parallel systems. We need floating schools. We need to find a place where Black children can be taught to read, where their culture is affirmed, where they feel loved and embraced in the classroom. And I'm going to end it with a little bit of neuroscience, right? So we know about the reading brain. We know that we want to build those neurological pathways, those connections for the letter to sound associations. right? So if you read The Reading Brain, the actual book, does a really good job of explaining that. What he also says is that those neurological connections happen more rapidly when we have those good neurotransmitters flowing, like dopamine, right? When we feel safe, when we feel happy, when we feel loved, those connections happen more quickly. How do we create those environments for our Black children who are sitting in classrooms? And that's the challenge that we have in front of us. So thank you for joining me this morning. And I don't know if we have time, but certainly I'm happy to take some questions.
Someone has one and we have a microphone we can bring to you. You have a question? I have a loud voice. So as a mother, and you found those barriers in the school system, which I see in my school as well, even with our good intentions. What kind of resources did you have to come up with to find to help your son with overcome the barriers of dyslexia and to help them improve to reading? What are some resources that you would recommend?
My solution is not one that might be an option for everyone. So I had a house and I sold it. I sold it and I used some of that money to send him to Windward, right? I consider Windward to be a floating school, operates outside of the jurisdiction of our public school system. That was something that was available to me for families where that's not an option, or they don't want to send their child to a school like Windward because that also comes with some other costs. He was the only Black boy in his classroom. So he came home and I had to then undo a lot of things. So there's always a toss up there. You have to really look for support and for resources within the community. And unfortunately, depending on your public school system, the resources might not be there. And so there might be some tutoring programs. There might be that are low cost. A lot of universities, so my son also used a university that was local, Iona, to do some intervention and to do testing as well. And then, and I say this because I don't think you can wait. So you have to find what is available, what's within your reach. It requires sometimes resources, not just money, but time to be able to do that. And that's why I also say to try to connect to a system of support that may have already done some of that work, and you can tap into that knowledge to find solutions as well, or quick solutions as well. I didn't really have that network, and like I said, there are things that I would have done differently. But now that I have my organization and families come to me, I tell them, well, don't sell your house, right? Those types of things, because just getting the diagnosis and just getting your child into the school is really just the beginning of the journey. I am 7 years later and still trying to figure it out. So now I wish I hadn't, I wish I had taken some other routes. Some people will sue the school district. It wasn't an option for me because I just couldn't take that chance. What if I lose? Then what happens? But I have come to learn that there are free ways to do this. And so really connect with those organizations who have already laid some of that groundwork. Do you need the mic?
I work inside of a school system. I teach them how to love. And often when we go through child study processes and then students go through testing and become eligible, we are hearing from central office that we are over-identifying Black boys. How?
With dyslexia?
With a learning disability.
So there are, I would dive into that more deeply, right? Because we do see over-identification in certain classifications. And I think within SLD in general, you might find that, but how specific is the diagnosis? Because what we don't see is over-identification specifically of dyslexia. So in Connecticut, one of my former board members did the Freedom of Information Act, and Connecticut is one of those states where they do have SLD, and then they also track it by dyslexia diagnosis. And what they found was that certainly there are a lot of children who are diagnosed with SLD who are Black, but when compared to their white peers, their white peers were 7 times more likely to, within that SLD classification, actually have a dyslexia diagnosis. So I would dig deeper, because sometimes we give that SLD classification, but we still don't really know what's going on.
They don't get the label of dyslexia.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, they don't give it. That's an advocacy issue, right? Because yeah, and it's an advocacy issue. A lot of school systems still feel like they can't do it, but there's nothing in the federal law that says you can't do it. And as a parent, if the parent has the diagnosis, even if the school doesn't want to give it, there is a part in the IEP for parental concerns. And this was actually one of my last straws with the school where they changed my words on it, but the parent can put it in there. And again, it's a system. And I will tell you that system is flawed, maybe not flawed. And for many families, you have to figure out a way to work outside of that system. Unfortunately, that is a large part of where we are. As we do that advocacy work, we have to find solutions that exist outside of it as well. But it's a hard truth that does exist, with no easy solution.
All right, please join me in thanking. Thank you all so much. And again, thank you to Ms. Resha Conroy. It's an honor to have her here with us from New York, and for your call to action for all of us this morning. I will just point out that in the state of Virginia, every school division has a dyslexia advisor. So that would be a person to connect with if you are a parent or a teacher. And then in terms of advocacy, Decoding Dyslexia Virginia, and they are here today with one of our vendor tables, and they would be another resource to connect you with in terms of